Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. I tell you what's catching the headlines and really the attention of much of the world is the situation in the Ukraine. And I'm delighted to have an expert, Michael Rubin, on. He's a resident scholar from the American Enterprise Institute. And we're going to talk about that situation today. You know, Joe Biden, or rather John Kerry, the Secretary of State, has made it perfectly clear that he's standing behind, and the United States is standing behind the people of Ukraine, kind of similar like he was standing behind the people of Syria when they said that they were going to flex some muscle over the chemical weapons deal. I wonder how much credibility that has, Michael, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, I think John Kerry can say with absolute certitude that we will be with the Ukrainian people before we're against the Ukrainian people. And certainly...
Yeah, that's really hedging your bets.
We don't have a good track record on this sort of red line.
Yeah, that's a good way of hedging your bets, isn't it?
Indeed.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit about, what was it, George McGovern said he was 110% behind his running mate, and, until they found out, that, after they found out the running mate, Eagleton, had the shock therapy. And we saw how well that held up for Eagleton. I don't know, it just reminds me of that kind of thing with Sergeant Shriver taking his place on the ticket in 1972. It's just, it really seems like empty words. And it seems like the Russians seem to know it's empty words. And I'm beginning to develop this theory that I want to bounce off you, Michael. I'm wondering if there's a chance that Russia could take a militaristic power play, knowing that that the worst case scenario is that, what's his name? Obama does flex a little muscle, which I think is highly unlikely, but make something protracted long enough to help Obama get enough votes in the Senate to make sure that his power is not weakened, because a stronger Obama makes for a stronger Russia. What do you think about that? Is that crazy?
Well, I mean, what I try to push at and look at in my book, Dancing with the Devil, the Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes, is the fact that our diplomats too often will, and our president, of course, as well, will project their own sincerity onto our opponents, and our opponents know this and play us each and every time. Oftentimes, it looks like our opponents are playing chess while we're playing checkers, and that certainly seems to be the case in the White House, unless President Obama is off playing solitaire.
No, I think he's playing solo hangman.
That may be the case. I'd say he's playing marbles, but I think he's lost them.
I think he's lost them. Very good. We could do this forever, couldn't we? So, there's no question about it. And I gotta tell you, from a real politic, perspective on the international scene, and I'm not a fan, obviously, of Putin. I'm a limited government anti-communist to the hilt, but it seems like he's about the only one who knows how to read the international tea leaves. Or am I wrong on that?
No, indeed. And, I mean, what unfortunately we are up against is when you put Neville Chamberlain up against Machiavelli, Chamberlain seldom wins. Now, a lot of people would say, hey, we don't want to be Machiavelli, and that's all well and good, but we've got to play the games our opponents are playing, otherwise we're going to get played completely.
No question about it. So what's the situation like today?
Well, today what we seem to have is Putin on one hand being silent, but on the other hand, these militias, which seem clearly to be Russian-backed, making a move to consolidate control over the Crimea, which is a very strategic peninsula that's part of the territory of the Ukraine, but has a great ethnic Russian population. And so we have the traditional policy by proxy, and this is also what many rogue regimes do. Pakistan, of course, uses the Taliban. Iran uses Hezbollah and Hamas, and now we have Vladimir Putin using similar proxies, these crack units who are refusing to identify themselves but are seizing newspapers, seizing airports, seizing the local parliament, and so forth. Yep,
absolutely, and it's interesting to see what's happening. Militarily, obviously, it's laughable to try to do a comparison between Russia and the folks during the Ukraine in terms of being able to handle this type of situation if it gets Russian involved. But how well do you think they're capable of handling this little terrorist group that's running around creating mayhem?
Well, Ukraine, of course, will be hard-pressed to do this because they're afraid of exposing their flank. They have more than 1,000-mile-long border with Russia, and Russia is flexing its muscles all around the border. So if Ukraine redeploys its troops down to the Crimea, they got to worry about what's going to happen in the north of their country. Certainly, this is something that what What we need to recognize is what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. We need to recognize that all our other allies in the region, the Baltic states, Azerbaijan, even Poland, are looking and seeing whether the United States and NATO are going to step up to the plate. I'm not sure there's that much that we can do, but if we do nothing, if we remain silent, then certainly they're going to figure they need to make their accommodation with Russia because no longer can the United States be trusted. That's global leadership in Obama's age.
So the Ukraine is like the un-Vegas, is what you're saying.
Exactly. I mean, it is the bride basket of the region, but it's also, I mean, of course, the bread basket as well.
Yeah, everything that happens there impacts, it's not a vacuum, is what you're saying. It has implications not only regionally, but potentially internationally. And it really could test the mettle of the Obama administration going forward. I tell you right now, I think all these particularly hostile regimes are interested in keeping Obama in power. By the way, continue my discussion with Michael Rubin. He is a scholar with the American Enterprise Institute, AEI.org. So how do you see the administration playing out? Are they going to be of any value to the poor people of the Ukraine?
No, ultimately I don't think they will. But the key issue is whether or not they are going to suggest that it is worthwhile to stand up and ally yourself with America. The Obama administration has been developing a very bad reputation for coddling its adversaries and bashing its allies, and that's something certainly that the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and everyone else in the region are now seeing. And it's not just in the region. I just came back from the Persian Gulf, and in Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates, I had very senior level officials tell me, for what reason would we ever want to ally ourselves with the United States? You guys can no longer be trusted. We don't like the Iranians, we don't like the Russians, but we've got to make our deal with them since we no longer can trust you.
Wow, that's incredible. And you're suggesting we'll probably see more of this in the years to come.
Absolutely.
So, how do you see it planning out? Do you think the Russians are going to go after it? Try to put their dictator back in power?
Well, they're going to try to put their dictator back in power one way or another. Maybe not the same dictator, but some other proxy. Of course, even under the best-case situation, they're making the Ukrainian opposition, which now has power, look kind of weak because they've taken over a large chunk of Ukrainian territory. Now, there's elections that are going to be called, and there's a tendency in the White House to want an even playing field, but Putin doesn't believe in even playing fields. So if we don't help the pro-Western elements because we want an even playing field, but Vladimir Putin gives them tens of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in aid, then what we have isn't an even playing field. We have Ukraine reincorporated effectively into some postmodern Soviet Union.
Yeah. It's interesting that the people of the Ukraine, the protesters, are saying that the parliament looks a lot like the parliament did just a few weeks ago. Not a whole lot of change there.
No, indeed. I mean, but one of the big elements, they have struck a moral blow at the pro-Russian leadership when they've just exposed the sheer luxury in which Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president, was living with his gold-plated toilets and so forth. If there's one thing we can learn from the last couple decades, with Muammar Gaddafi as well, that once these pictures emerge, certainly it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, no question about it. You look at the mess in Syria, and the government to me seems very emboldened, and they've figured out how to drag this along in bureaucracy with conferences that do nothing. I tell you, to me, it reminds me a lot in the Carter years. Using the Chamberlain analogy, 13 countries fell to communism during Carter's administration. The unlucky 13. These were unaligned countries at the beginning of his administration and fell in that short 4-year span. I expect a lot of shifts in geopolitics in the next 2.5 years.
Well, Kevin, just look at the last couple of years. We had anti-regime, pro-Western protests erupt in Iran. We had similar in Syria, and that was before the civil war started. We have the same thing going on now in Ukraine and in Venezuela. In each case, the protesters are protesting against an anti-American government in favor of more liberty, more freedom. Their protests coincide with American interests, and so what does the White House do? We turn their back on them.
Yep, that's exactly right. Exactly right. So what is the message to Congress on this, which, of course, they have already got so many grounds of impeachment, from Benghazi to Fast and Furious to God knows what else, but there's no intestinal fortitude even in the House in spite of that. But what can the very impotent Congress do about this?
Well, the problem is Congress's impotence. In theory, Congress is more important it can be more important in foreign policy than the State Department and perhaps in some cases than the President itself. In the past, we've seen Congress act with the Iraq-Libya Sanctions Act, for example, which really put pressure on Muammar Gaddafi. We have the Iraq Liberation Act, which might be more controversial. But the fact of the matter is, if Congress wants to take a stand, it can. Unfortunately, this Congress is afraid to step up and contradict the White House, even when it looks like the White House is derelict in its duties.
Mm-hmm. No question about it. Very, very disturbing time. Michael Rubin, very glad to have you on. We're going to have to get you back again. We need to keep a track on this to see how it unfolds. He's with the American Enterprise Institute, a Washington think tank. You can learn more about them at AEI.org. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Kevin.
When we come back, much more for you. I do want to remind you, best content here. It shows up over there at usdailyreview.com. While there, like it on Facebook, follow it on Twitter. And you're listening to The Price of Business.